Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert McLaughlin. Welcome to the New Zealand Mathematical Society seminar. Our speaker today is Dion O'Neill from the University of Auckland. Dion was my student and did a nice thesis in numerical analysis. In fact, I remember the day you first turned up in my office, someone from Wairarapa wanting to do a PhD in mathematics. What year was that?
2005, 4, 5, I think.
So, we've had some adventures since then, and at the physics department at the University of Auckland, and he's going to be speaking today on modelling COVID-19 in Aotearoa New Zealand.
Thanks, Robert.
Take it away, Dion.
I'm hoping Emily Harvey's in here somewhere. I did send the link on to her. So she's been co-leading this work with me, and I'm hoping she might even be able to jump in and tell me when I've got things wrong and either misrepresenting things or explaining them badly. So it's a cast of, well, dozens who have been helping out with this work. So people who probably be known to some of this community, Emily Harvey and Oliver McLaren, and then there's some PhD students and master's students and honours students who've helped out recently. And so this is something that, while it sort of builds on something that's been an interest of mine for a while, so processes on and of networks, epidemics on networks wasn't something I was specifically looking at until around February last year, when suddenly it seemed like it was going to be incredibly relevant to know about how things spread on networks that might look at some things that I've been working on previously, which was how people get linked up by employment and how they interact through schools. And thought, well, given that we've got two parts of what seems like might be describing New Zealand, we should probably try and stitch the rest of the bits up and see if we can do something useful with it. So, as sort of just some background.
Dion, we just had a request to see the full screen view of the slides.
Oh, okay. Is it? I'll try that. Is that working?
Right.
Better? Right. So, if you're going to do any kind of modelling of epidemics, then there's, I guess, a minimum set or a hierarchy of different questions you might want to try and answer. So, the basic thing, if you're going to bother to try and model an epidemic at all, you should probably be able to answer how many people are going to get infected and when they're going to get infected. And maybe you should even be able to do something like, say, when do you expect the peak of an epidemic to be? Or what's your worst day going to look like? And to be honest, you could do that with a nice deterministic SIR model and probably get something halfway decent. And especially early on in the stages of an epidemic, we've got limited data to go on. So you won't necessarily have fantastic parameterization of all your pathogen behavior. But then going on from that, you might want to be able to answer a little bit more. So it might matter who specifically is going to get infected, and that could mean who in terms of where these people are, or it could mean in terms of their age or their sex or their ethnicity or other demographic factors. And you'd care about that because of underlying health conditions that might be associated with those, or different outcomes for people, or just how you're going to try and plan your response. Related to that, you'd possibly want to know about what the outcomes are going to be for those people when they get infected. So hospitalization risk or risk of severe health outcomes or death, and particularly when any of those link up to any of the demographic factors that might be covered in that second point. And then sort of going down in our hierarchy of granularity, it would be possibly useful to know where people are getting infected or how they're getting infected. Because if you know that, then you can look in those places in order to try and intervene and have any kind. So if any knowledge you have about factors that drive infection risk are opportunities to limit that infection risk. So that could be, are people getting infected in workplaces versus schools? If they're getting infected in workplaces, are they people who are in those workplaces because they have a particular job and didn't have any other choice than to work on site, or did they choose to work on site even though they could have been working from home? And then assuming now you've been able to model everything down to the level that you've got some interventions that you can recommend, you can start to ask questions like, what kind of resource constraints are you going to discover from those interventions? So this could be things like contact tracing constraints, but it could also, you might also want to look at things like risk factors for individuals. So this is, I guess, coming back to what I was talking about before, if you've got people who have to be working on site during an epidemic, are those factors going to be correlated with them possibly being on low income or possibly having multiple jobs? And having multiple jobs is going to mean they're in contact with more people or play a bigger role in linking things up. Do they go home to a household that has more intergenerational living, or are they playing some other role in the community that might make them more or less linky? So that's the type of things that we might want to be able to look at. The reason we'd want to look at these things is, the short version of it is so that we can take an equity lens to modeling epidemics. So not everyone's got the same risk of being infected. We know that factors like household crowding are bad for disease transmission. The method by which you travel to work and the distance you have to travel to work might matter. So if you're taking public transport versus being able to walk to work because you can live close to your place of work, the type of work you do, so different environments have different transmission risks. So we saw last year in the US, there was some research that suggested that people working in cool stores and abattoirs tended to get infected once you control for everything else at higher rates than other people. And then there's all sorts of factors such as socioeconomic disadvantage and security of work. So if your employment is somewhat tenuous and you think you've got a bit of a sniffle, you might be more likely to go to work than if your employment is nice and secure and you know that your employer is fantastic and will let you stay home from work on some sick leave. And of course, vaccination status is something that's becoming more and more interesting. So people don't have the same risk of being infected. They also have different risks of developing serious infection consequences, and that's linked to underlying health conditions. And these risk factors, they're typically going to be correlated. So they're not just distributed at random over the population. We can't just go and say we've got a homogeneous New Zealand and 3% of people are in tenuous employment and separately 10% of people have an underlying health condition and sort of just multiply things through together. And obviously that's related to the point at the bottom that you can end up with clustering of these risk factors. So people who might be at greater risk of being infected are going to be potentially in situations where there are worse infection consequences. Just as an example of how some of this heterogeneity in population plays out. So these plots here show you for 4 different...
Dion, your screen's not changing from me. I don't know if anyone else is seeing changing screens.
Yeah. Anyone else able to see? It should be a slide that's got 4 different bar plots on it.
We're still on the questions screen, Dion.
Oh dear. Any update now?
No.
Oh dear.
It's because of what you're sharing, Dion.
You have to stop sharing and start again.
Okay, right. I will try that.
Maybe share the screen rather than the application.
Try that. Jump back to Zoom.
Yes.
Right,
Boom.
and let's see if it, I think what happened last time was the moving to full screen. Has that jumped back to a motivation slide?
No.
No, okay, let's try this one more time. Actually, we might just have to stick with it being shared without it being in presenter mode, because it seems like each time I move to presenter mode, it changes it to a different screen, which then Zoom can't find. Actually, okay, I'll be ambitious. One more try. No, screen sharing has failed. Maybe this. Is that showing some stacked bar plots now?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Brilliant. Okay, phew, goodness. Right. Shouldn't have gone with Keynote. Okay, so examples of heterogeneity and why it matters. So we've got 4 sets of some stacked bar plots here representing, so each one is one different age band, and we've broken so each bar is a dwelling size. We want to put our people into dwellings of different sizes when we build our contagion network. And there's a dashed horizontal line running across each bar chart. So let's say we're going to look at the age group for people who are 15 to 29 years old. So we've got our dashed line there. So that represents what is the proportion of people who are 15 to 29 years old. And so if we just said, okay, sorry, that's the proportion of people of ethnicity other. So this is excluding Māori, Māori Pacific or Pacific. So the people who are in that age group. And so if we just spread that across all of our different dwelling sizes, that dashed line is what is the distribution we'd have. And so for the small dwelling sizes, that's not a bad approximation, but what we see for the large dwelling sizes, so let's go and look at a dwelling of size 10. So this is you bring COVID home to this dwelling size, you're going to infect potentially 9 other people. You can see that other ethnicity doesn't look at all like what the average representation of that ethnicity is. And so you've got a huge overrepresentation of Māori and Pacific families in large dwellings compared with European and Asian ethnicities. And so we want to be able to capture that type of heterogeneity in demography when we do our epidemic modeling. Right. So traditionally, how would you build an epidemic model? Well, you'd probably, simple thing, maybe write down an SIR model. So put people into some, actually this example here, I've got one extra state, an exposed state. So put people into a box, they're either susceptible or exposed or infectious or recovered. And the first assumption you normally make when you do this is let's go and assume that you've got a nice well-mixed population and that everyone's got equal probability of interacting with everyone else, and that basically New Zealand just looks like a box with particles of gas in it, people colliding at random. And if you're only worried about running your model for very long times and seeing what is the final outcome, are you going to infect everyone or will your epidemic die out? Maybe that's good enough. But if you want to answer any of the questions other than that very first one in our list of minimum questions a contagion model might have to do, then this homogeneous well-mixed population assumption doesn't hold very well. And it makes sense that the infected running man up in Auckland isn't going to be equally likely to infect someone in Auckland compared with the blue woman in Fiordland. So what we do instead is build an interaction network that we're going to run our contagion process on. And there's a bunch of reasons why you shouldn't do this. It makes things a whole lot more complicated and means you've got a whole lot of trouble in terms of how you try and build a realistic interaction network. But if you can do it, then you've got the potential to look at things at a much more fine-grained level. So the goal here is you want to represent New Zealand by explicitly representing each individual with some individual level attributes, and you give them an interaction pattern. And so then you put your contagion process on this network and you let it run and you spread through that network. So for example, our green infected bicycle man here, he's only able to infect the people who he has a direct connection with on the interaction network. So that's A, B, and C, and can't directly infect D, for example. The way that we build this in reality, though, is we build what's called a bipartite network. So we split our network up into one set of nodes. We're going to have about 5 million of them that are our individuals. And then we have these group nodes or interaction contexts that individuals get linked to. And so, for example, we've got here A, B, C, and E all linked to this dwelling, group 1. And then E, C, and D all linked to, maybe this is a workplace here, group 2. And so there's a couple of reasons why we might choose to have an interaction, or sorry, bipartite interaction network. The first one's somewhat conceptual, and that's because by doing this, it makes it easier to explicitly encode the properties of the interaction context themselves. So if we want to go and say that we have high transmission within dwellings compared with workplaces because people don't wear their masks when they're at home, then we're able to do that. It's an easy thing to add on to this. Or we can assign attributes to the type of workplace, for example, or we could put that workplace explicitly at some point in space. There's a computational reason why we'd like to do this as well. And so if you think, for example, of just a single school of 1,000 students and the number of connections you're going to need to represent the interactions between those students. So if you have a network that's got people interacting directly, you're going to need to have, for each one of those 1,000 students, they're linked up to 999 other students. So you get 1,000, you get almost 1 million interactions there. Instead, if you wanted to represent that school with a bipartite network, you've got your 1,000 students and they all have one link to the school, their interaction context, and so you only need 1,000 links or 1,000 edges in your graph in order to describe that. And so it turns out that it is possible to make a interaction network. If it's a bipartite network for a country about the size of New Zealand, we can fit that into computer memory on the HPC, whereas the direct interaction network we'd struggle to. So it turns something that would be computationally infeasible into something that suddenly becomes more feasible. So the way we build our bipartite network is by thinking of each of the different interaction contexts separately. So we've got our individuals and our different group nodes. Our individuals, we actually have about only 4.7 million people in our version of New Zealand. And this is because the data we use to build our network comes from the 2018 census. And what we didn't try and do was to build an exact replication of New Zealand with specific nodes being specific people, but rather a representation of New Zealand has about the right number of people of about the right demographic attributes. So that difference between 4.7 million and 5 point something million, we're happy just to gloss over that and to say this is a country that looks roughly like Aotearoa. Each of our individuals, we give them an age band, an ethnicity, a sex, and a location. And the location is their SA2 of usual residence as indicated in Census 2018. So an SA2 is a spatial unit of mostly around 1,000 to 2,000 people. And then we've got some administrative data where we can where it's relatively straightforward to try and build an empirical layer in our network. So for example, workplaces, we can use tax and census data from Statistics New Zealand in order to link people up to their places of employment. For schools, we've got relatively good data from the Ministry of Education and again from Statistics New Zealand about the role of schools and where they are located. And then for dwellings, we've got census information again. Now, some of you will probably remember Census 2018 was the first time New Zealand tried to run an online first version of census. And this worked well for people who were happy doing things online first, and it worked less well for people who weren't. And so there's some definite issues in the data quality. Some of them have been fixed over time. Stats NZ have been really good about trying to impute data, but still in the dwelling data, for example, there are particular groups, young Pacifica males is the worst case, where we've got around 20% of them don't have a dwelling linked to the individuals. And it's not because we believe that that group has 20% homelessness, it's because we believe that the data isn't accurate and hasn't served them well. So 3 layers that we can build from empirical data relatively well: employment, education, and dwellings. And then there's this 4th layer that we just call community, where we lump in every other type of interaction that we haven't explicitly captured through some other empirical data. And so this would include things like casual interactions when you're shopping or taking public transport together, or going to churches, or sports clubs, meeting up for picnics in alert level 3 stage, whatever, or step 0.1 in Auckland with 1 other household at a time, wearing your mask and not using anyone else's toilet. All that type of stuff gets captured in that community layer. And so that we build out of a mishmash of different third-party data sources. So, for example, data from electronic transactions or from contact surveys. And when all else fails, we go and just look at the social network literature for interaction patterns. Right, so cartoon there of the 4 layers in our network. Now, in an ideal world, we'd build this network inside the Statistics New Zealand integrated data infrastructure, where we could use the linked microdata and build just one explicit representation of the network. There's a few reasons why that's not practical. One is that the stats integrated data infrastructure, the servers that run on aren't actually capable of running our contagion model on them. But there's also the issue that if we did that, then we'd then be tied to one particular realization of this network that we know has issues in terms of data quality, and there's other factors about bringing in third-party data sources. So instead, what we do is we use that linked microdata within the IDI, the Stats NZ integrated data infrastructure, and we go looking within that for any possible correlations that we think are going to be relevant to our interaction network that we want to build. And so we go and extract from the IDI, making sure we've satisfied all the sufficient confidentiality rules and that nothing's identifiable and that everyone remains anonymous, just correlations between people and putting them in particular boxes, whether it's age, sex, ethnicity, plus their location. And then from all these correlations that we've got, we go and probabilistically reconstruct a set of interaction networks that we hope represents something like what Aotearoa looks like. And so the final network that we end up with is a mix of something that's built from data from in the IDI where we've reconstructed, plus these third-party data sources that maybe never existed or where we were never able to see the underlying linked microdata. So the scenario that we've got looks kind of like this. We've got this finally formed microdata inside the IDI. We go and process that heavily to get some distributions and correlations that we're able to extract and that we're able to make sure satisfy the confidentiality rules. And then once we've got those, we need to somehow try and reconstruct a network, an interaction network out of them. So it's a little bit like we've got a cow, we've made it into a hamburger, and the reconstructed network is trying to make that hamburger back into a cow. Except in reality, we're wanting to make a number of different cows in order to try and make sure that we've sufficiently sampled the space of all cows so that we've got a network that's representative of the topological properties of what we think New Zealand's interactions look like, as opposed to trying to focus just on one single realization of that when we're not 100% confident that that realization is an accurate description. So at that point, we've got an interaction network that we think might halfway represent New Zealand. We better put a contagion process on top of it. So the process we use is a Gillespie algorithm. So it's a Markovian process. And to start off with, we use the amazing package Epidemics on Networks. So it's a Python package. One of the co-authors is Joel Miller from La Trobe University in Melbourne. We've actually, since we started on that, we've extended and rewritten this package to the point that I don't think we're actually using any of the original source code for it now. So we've essentially developed in-house a completely new Epidemics on Networks package. Anyway, so Gillespie algorithm, essentially how it works is we start with all our people in our network, we give them a particular state, and we go and for each person, we go and compute what's the rate of change going to be for all the possible events, all the possible state changes that they could have take place. And so we compute a total rate of change for our whole system. Then we go and we calculate the amount of time that until the very first possible event that could have happened occurs. So pick that out of an exponential distribution and we select that event and say that's our next event that's going to occur. And then once we've chosen an event, we choose what type of event that is going to be. So we've chosen a time that an event will occur, and then proportionate to each event's rate, we choose what type of event that's going to be. We make a change to one of the states of our nodes, recalculate any rates that we need to, and repeat this process. So we've got a stochastic spreading process. And so the obvious part, I guess, is that we'd have some kind of disease progression. But in addition to that, we've also got explicit representation of a contact tracing process and people going out and seeking testing and people moving into states that account for them being quarantined or moving into isolation. Just a quick sort of step through of some of the states that we have in this modeling. So our people start off as susceptible, and after being exposed to someone who's infectious, they can transition into an exposed state. So at this point, they don't have any symptoms. They can develop, and they're not infectious yet. They can, from exposed, develop on to being pre-symptomatic. So at this point, they still don't have symptoms, but they are infectious now. And then they can go on to develop symptoms, and they can either recover or they can die. And so they move between these states with some exponentially distributed waiting times. But I mentioned we've also got people seeking testing and contact tracing processes. So we'd better for each copy of these states here, make another copy where people's behavior is changed because they've been detected either through possibly through contact tracing or because they developed symptoms and went out and sought a test and moved themselves into a quarantine state. So this is going to mean that someone who's, say, pre-symptomatic and moves from the PU, the untested state, into PQ, the quarantine state, is no longer going, or depending on the rules in the algorithm, is no longer going to go out and interact with all the people in the other interaction contexts other than the ones in their dwelling, for example. And then we've got an extra set of states when people are confirmed as being infectious. And so in these cases, people were moved into to managed isolation. And so then hopefully you have no further infections stemming from, we actually have, I think it's about a 1% leak rate from managed isolation. And so there's people transitioning all over this state diagram. So we haven't shown here the states for asymptomatic cases because some people never go on to develop symptoms. And this becomes particularly relevant once you start vaccinating a fraction of your population and you have breakthrough infections, but those breakthrough infections are less likely to be symptomatic and hence less likely to know that they need to go out and seek a test. And we haven't put in here, we haven't indicated hospitalization states or critical care states. Right, so now we've got an interaction network and we've got a contagion process we can run on it. So we can start thinking about what sorts of questions we might be able to answer. So early on last year, one of the key focuses of this modeling was to look at community testing rates and or test seeking rates and the likelihood of being able to eliminate an epidemic given that we had some instance of community spread, community detection. So one of the key findings that came out of this, and it's an obvious finding, but it was surprising how much of a tipping point it appeared to be, was that if you can detect an outbreak while the total outbreak size is small, then you've got very good odds of going on to subsequently eliminate that outbreak. So the data that's presented here, this is old variant is wild type, so a version of COVID that was around in the first half of 2020. New variant in this case is alpha, which we now look back fondly on as a pretty friendly and not too terrible version of COVID. So we found things like if you're able to detect your outbreak so that you have fewer than about a dozen cases at the time of detection, then you've actually got really good odds of, if you then switch on your intervention strategy, and I think the intervention strategy in these scenarios might have been switched to alert level 4, you've got really good odds of being able to eliminate your outbreak within, in this case, it was within 60 days. And so I think elimination here, we are actually meaning that that all your cases have recovered. There's a shorter time frame to the point where you've completely contained your outbreaks. You've found everyone, and any infectious cases are known and isolating, and so you're not going to get subsequent spread from them. Alternatively, if your outbreak size at detection, if you let it get large because you've got poor test seeking behavior, then you have your probability of being able to eliminate within some particular time frame plummets away. So August last year, we had an outbreak of community transmission in Auckland, and people might remember Auckland moved to alert level 3, and then towards the later half of the lockdown period moved to this alert level 2.5, as it was called. And we still had active cases in the community, or there were still new cases being detected from day to day while we were at alert level 2.5, and we managed to eliminate that outbreak despite that. And so the Prime Minister asked, insensibly, would alert level 5 therefore have been enough to be sufficient to have eliminated that outbreak in August 2020? And in short, the answer is no. And the reason for this is because it matters the order in which you do things, and it matters, I guess, what you've done previously, and once you switch to an alert level 2.5. So the charts here are just showing some predictions for what would have happened if an outbreak was seeded from in a scenario with no alert level interventions detected. That's at day 0 in these plots here, and then subsequently we moved to either alert level 2.5, 3, or 4. And so the plot's basically saying alert level 2.5, we would have expected cases to go up. Alert level 3, we expect them to go up, peak, and come down. And alert level 4, the same, but faster, more effective. So what's going on there, there's this sort of an apparent paradox there, in that we did eliminate with alert level 2.5 at the end of a period of alert level 3 in Auckland last year. And a lot of that comes down to that alert level. During that alert level 3, you've got contact tracing processes running that are isolating people, and so that you know a lot of your chains of transmission, and so you've already identified your chains of transmission before you move to alert level 2.5. So you've sort of already banked some of your future intervention before you make that change. And that's likely to be, and there's other factors as well, but that's likely to be one of the big reasons why we see that we wouldn't have been able to eliminate if we had started at alert level 2.5, but you can use it to finish off and mop things up. We also looked last year, and this seems somewhat naive now, at the effect of increased transmissibility of variance. So this is for alpha back when that was the worst thing we had to worry about. So what did alpha do to transmissibility and the effectiveness of alert level 3 potentially? And basically these results said that while with wild type, the plot on the left, alert level 3 would have been enough to get you to elimination within a reasonable time frame. With alpha, it was going to be pretty marginal, and you're going to need alert level 4 in order to get to elimination within a reasonable time frame, while alert level 3 gave suppression-like behavior. And if you let these simulations just run on longer and longer, you just basically keep wandering around at sort of dozens, maybe 50, maybe 100 cases per day, assuming all this time that your contact tracing and your MIQ and everything else is functioning perfectly, and the probability of it continuing to function perfectly obviously decreases as you go on further and further in time. We were able to answer some questions about what the requirements would be in terms of capacity for contact tracing or number of people who might have to isolate themselves. Yes, this is for self-isolating individuals. I can't remember what the assumption is for which variant of COVID is sitting behind these. But the key result is that, so what's happening here, I think we, yeah, can't remember which variant this is for and what the scenario is behind it. But basically saying that if we didn't change alert levels, you're going to end up with huge numbers of people needing to be contacted via contact tracing and subsequently self-isolating. While if you move to an alert level 3, then you're able to reduce interactions enough that your contact tracing is able to maybe keep up with your peak amount there. So the requirement for the number of phone calls they'd need to make per day, or number of people they'd need to isolate over time. There were a couple of points in time where community transmission was detected and ministers would wait for a day or two before making a call on whether or not they were going to change the alert level for the country. And so we're able to say, what were the consequences of doing that in the absence of any extra information about, something about the scenario in which you detected things. So all that sort of anecdotal background information, and the story there isn't particularly surprising. The longer you wait, the harder it is to bring things under control. That's tied very closely back to that initial finding that if you can keep your initial size of outbreak at detection, and at the point where you change your alert level and intervene, if that's below about a dozen, then you've got very good odds of elimination. While if you wait longer, you're effectively saying you detect later or you intervene later, while you've got a much larger outbreak. So it's as if you're detected with a bigger outbreak, and your probability of elimination drops off pretty quickly the longer you wait. So that's that move down in the curves here for any given number of cases at detection. So it would turn, say, a detecting with about a dozen cases from a scenario that looks pretty good and like you're likely to control things, to looking a little bit marginal if you were to wait for 1 week before you changed alert levels. Now, because we've put spatial information for all our dwellings and all our workplaces and such underneath, or in our network underneath this, we, in principle, are able to model spatial spread. The caveat, or the grain of salt that goes with all this, is that this is only as good as our spatial interaction data. So we're pretty happy with that in terms of the workplaces and schools and dwellings. We're less happy with that in terms of our current data for how people move for those community interactions. So the results in this, definitely take them with a grain of salt. It's for an entirely hypothetical scenario that we don't think our disease parameters in this case are at all accurate either. And so this is, we seed a case in the Christchurch region and let it run forward, and the heat maps here just showing number of cases in each SA2 over time. And what happens is, I think that SA2 that ends up dark red is one that's got some University of Canterbury hostels in there. We haven't made any assumption about students going home from their hostels to isolate with families rather than staying in these large dwellings. And so once infection gets into these large dwellings, it rips through them pretty quickly, giving this great big spike here. Similarly, we're able to, because we've got demographic information about the people who are being infected, and again, this is some very early results, and so we're not, this isn't matched to any particular current scenario. We're able to look at what fraction of people are being infected by age group or by ethnicity. And so this was another set of simulations where we set 10 runs going in Christchurch. And in this case, rather than finding its way into student accommodation, the outbreak found its way into we went back and looked at the particular nodes, it found its way back into an aged care facility. In specific, run 4 found its way into an aged care facility, and so we see this change from relatively flat looking age distributions in most of the cases, except in run 4, where there's a massive spike in over 65s. And for that same set of runs, we look at the ethnicity of who got infected. For most of the runs, it looks pretty much like an average of what's happening across Christchurch, except in that run 4, where it turns out population in an aged care facility in Christchurch tends to mostly be European. So that hence that big spike there. And we can look at the interaction context where we saw spread taking place. So this, I'm assuming, must have been a set of runs where we had applied a relatively strong alert level intervention. I'm assuming alert level 4 because we've got very little infection taking place in community events and most of it happening within dwellings. And in fact, this suggests that probably this was just for some made up numbers for what the intervention looked like, because we've still got schools and workplaces having large numbers of interventions. So just to show that we can get out this type of data, I'll show another example in a minute that's actually applying this in a more useful scenario. So more recently, these are some results from the current outbreak. So we were asked to provide some modelling on what would be the possible consequences of switching Auckland from alert level 4 into alert level 3 in, I can't even remember when we were talking about that now, mid-September, I think it was. And so we ran those. So this is from detection with a single case, switching to alert level 4, and then around mid-September switching to alert level 3 and making sure that we've parameterized things to track the outbreak as it was to that point. So that's the black line on these 3 plots on the left here are the actual case numbers up to that point in time, and then look forward to what would be the consequences of switching to alert level 3. And because there's always a case of having to guess a little bit about how people are going to react in one of those alert level changes. So whether they're going to be particularly good with transmission reduction behavior in their workplaces, or how many extra community interactions are going to take place because of that change in alert level. We ran both an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario for that. And so we predicted that moving to alert level 3 in the optimistic scenario, you mostly got suppression-like behavior. In a couple of cases, you got some blow up and you went back to a growth scenario. So the blue lines are scenarios where we have eventual containment of the outbreak. The red lines are ones that don't eventually contain within, I'm guessing this was just over that 60-day window for the colouring here. So it's not to say that if we had have carried on with alert level 3, we wouldn't have contained eventually. And then in our pessimistic scenario, we predict that we would have had an increase in case numbers, and that would have happened, I think it was a couple of weeks, I think 2 or 3 weeks after, or would have taken about at least 2 to 3 weeks after that change in alert level before you'd start to see those case numbers rise up and realize that you were on a bad trajectory. And so this was turns out that what did happen with case numbers looked something like what happened with the pessimistic scenario here. But I'd say that this was the case where we got the right result, but not for entirely the right reason. So in this model here, we're able to say we're able to make some parameterization of the overall or the average behavior of people in terms of their interactions, specifically what led to the growth in case numbers in the Auckland outbreak this time was that we had spread into highly marginalized, underserved communities who are mistrustful of authority. So where contact tracing was particularly ineffective and where alert levels weren't able to have any kind of effect at all. So while we can capture some of the consequences of of maintaining cases after spread into that community, I wouldn't claim at all that our model isn't detailed enough to model the case of when you've got someone who maybe has a drug addiction is faced with the choice of, do they get a COVID test, knowing that if they test positive, they're going to be locked in MIQ for 2 weeks, and in a scenario of going cold turkey versus just doing nothing and hoping for the best. What we were able to do though was to say the types of interaction contexts that go along with those case numbers over time. So these plots on the right here, the different colored bars on them are the different interaction contexts. So EX and EV are community interactions, S is schools, the blue, and W is workplaces, D is dwellings. And so as you'd expect, we predict that once you turn on alert level 4, so that's the first dotted line on these graphs here, you almost completely cut out your community interactions. So you've only got people going to the supermarket and very low transmission while they're there. And you instead shift almost all of your cases into dwellings. And so you actually see a rise in the number of cases after dwelling, and you see things continue to go up a little bit even after you've turned on your alert level 4 intervention, as these infected people stay at home and spread to other dwelling members before they're able to be detected and isolated, and small amounts of spread through workplaces. And yeah, while you've still got some essential workers. And then the effect of moving to alert level 3 was that we'd see a big increase in the in both the fraction and the total number of infections taking place in this EX context, which is what we call is our code for the close community contacts. So these are things where people might be interacting in a smallish group for an extended period of time. So it's not as you walk past someone in the supermarket, in this case, it's actually modeled as mostly people joining up households to form extended bubbles, which was one of the key changes at moving to alert level 3, that people were allowed to form an extended bubble under an increased set of circumstances. And I haven't put a slide in for this, but what we did at the same time was to look at, in our interaction network, what was the effect of changing, adding a small increase in the number of those extended bubbles at alert level 3. And what we saw is that for alert level 4, you've got an interaction network that's largely disconnected. Your largest component size in there is in the order of tens of thousands of people. Once you add in just this very small increase in people extending their bubbles, so it's only in the order of adding maybe 5% more links to your network, you move through this percolation threshold and you move into the scenario where you've now got a largest connected component that's on the order of about 1.5 million. And so I'm not saying that this is why alert level 3 went bad in Auckland, but it's saying why I guess there was a risk that things could get out of control once things went bad from alert level 3 in Auckland, is that you've changed the structure of your network quite dramatically, even from that small change in the number of links, by moving through that phase transition and getting that condensation phenomenon in the network. Got asked very recently, and this part isn't published yet, or isn't publicly available yet. The report has been sent to ministries and it will get published eventually. Got asked about the effect of opening schools from Delta outbreak in Auckland. And so this doesn't exactly match the scenario with schools going back that's happened in reality, because in this case, we just turn on all schools, or we switch from schools catering only for children of essential workers, which is around 3% of children being at school, through to almost all children being at school. And so unpredictably, because one of the tricky things is to guess what's the amount of transmission reduction relative to uncontained or to an alert level 1 scenario that you get in these close community contacts. We ran these for 3 different levels of transmission reduction. So you can pick any one of the vertical columns there, and maybe the 70% transmission reduction is your optimistic one, maybe it's realistic, depends on the type of person you are. And so unsurprisingly, opening schools, you get more spread. So that's the difference between your, say, your green lines and your red lines in here. So that's not surprising. The more interesting finding, though, is when we look at the context where those infections take place in those two scenarios. So after 30 days, opening schools, effectively, you've doubled your number of daily cases that are going to be reported according to this model. But if we look at the transmission context for where those infections are coming from, they're not coming directly from schools. They're not occurring within schools. So we've got about probably 10% or 12% of infections are happening within schools once we open them back up. What happens, though, is that we get a bump in, so moving from just the proportion of infections to the absolute number of infections, we get this increase when we go from schools closed to schools open, an increase in the number of infections happening both in dwellings and in the community interaction contexts. And so again, this is another example of the role that network structure plays in affecting the outcomes of contagion. So what schools are really good at doing is connecting up parts of society that wouldn't otherwise be infected or wouldn't otherwise be connected. And so the people who are going to work, for example, at alert level 3, or meeting up for their picnic in the park with a friend, they suddenly become more likely to be infected and subsequently create a whole new chain of transmission because they've had someone in their school, in their household, who is attending a school. So if that small bump in the number of infections in schools drives a large increase in the number of infections in total.
Dion, we're almost out of time.
Okay, this I think is my last content-filled slide anyway, so it's timing works. So I guess the key message to take away from all this is that heterogeneity plays a big role in if you're modeling contagion dynamics. So it plays a role in how the contagion plays out, but it also obviously plays a role in terms of equity, in terms of who is affected. There's all sorts of non-linearities at play here. There's all sorts of interventions that have a different effect depending on what other interventions are happening at the same time. My claim would be modeling these things on an interaction network is a challenging but useful way to try and get at them. Yeah, so thanks everyone for listening. It's a photo there of some of the team that have contributed to this.
Thank you very much, Dion, and that's a nice photo. I'm going to throw it open for questions now. If you have a question, just turn on your microphone and go for it.
I have a question.
Hey, Alona.
Hi, Dion. Thanks for an interesting talk. I have several questions, but I'll start with the first one. Did you take immunization into account?
Yeah, so in recent simulations we do. So we apply vaccination. Initially, we just had some course vaccination data at DHB level, and more recently, we have this by age group, sex, and ethnicity at SA2 level. So relatively fine-grained, and both for people who have only 1 dose and 2 dose, and we get that updated once a week. Yeah, and then we can also just make some sort of course guesses for what we think future vaccination levels are going to look like and the consequences of those.
So can you comment on your findings in relation to this? Is this similar to what the Prime Minister showed us last Monday, the graph that peaks at 200?
Yeah, so that graph comes from a different team within Te Puna Hamatatini who use a branching process model, which has a well-mixed population. And so as an input, they need to, one, assume some blanket level of reduction in RF, and also they don't have this interaction structure underneath. And so I'm cautious. I don't want to be, I don't know, fanning the flames of doom here. But essentially what you can end up with, so it depends who gets vaccinated and how that's spread around. So if you spread your vaccinations well across society, then you've got lots of opportunity to break chains of transmission. If, however, your vaccination gets clustered into the same groups, then what you can essentially do is partition your network up into a part of the network that has very low spread, possibly with R less than 1, and another part of the network that has essentially no protection from vaccination because your unvaccinated people are all friends with other unvaccinated people, and a vaccine mandate has meant that they're not able to interact in the parts of society that are most protected. So these vaccine mandates, they sort of give an extra boost in protection if you are vaccinated, more than just what vaccination by itself would do, but they give an increase in risk if you're unvaccinated effectively because you've got people who are more likely to be interacting with other unvaccinated people. So these cases that have numbers peaking at 200, that's assuming that you've spread your vaccinations equally. And I guess, yeah, my takeaway would be you're going to see probably higher growth rates than that, but in a smaller portion of the population. So you might end up with only 200 still, but you're going to have those cases occurring disproportionately in your unvaccinated population. So it's rural, it's Māori, it's people who have low trust in authority or poor access to healthcare. Yeah, all the things we might expect.
Thanks.
Trung has a hand up.
Hey, Trung.
Hi, Dion. Thanks for the very nice introduction to the model. Have a few questions. So first, it's technical details that I just quickly. So how long does it take for the model to run like for 30 days for one city or for the whole New Zealand?
So the big thing that makes the model easy to run or difficult to run is the total number of cases you get. So uncontrolled spread in 30 days, things are able to go to hell and you get a very large number of cases, and then you're on the order of running for hours, maybe. The biggest constraint is a memory constraint. So our thing is, if we can keep this below on the order of 20 gigabytes of memory per simulation, then the nodes that we run this on are much more plentiful, and in effect, things run faster because we're running a few hundred realizations of each simulation. Yeah.
So it means the model will be slower when the number of nodes are increased. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or when there's less interventions.
So I saw the rise tail in alert level 3 when you model the Auckland, right? Could you explain why?
So that rising tail is effectively just saying that alert level 3 plus the infectivity that comes from Delta in many cases wasn't sufficient to get suppression. So that's making a bunch of assumptions about how much transmission reduction you'll get in the contexts that do remain open at alert level 3, and about the transmissibility of Delta, and about the proclivity of people to seek testing in the community if they develop symptoms, and about the ability of contact tracers to identify people. And so once all those things are rolled in, the prediction was that alert level 3 would have been in many cases insufficient to contain a Delta outbreak when it starts with a trajectory that looks like the preceding trajectory.
Yep. So just last question. Like in general, when you model 8 billion images algorithmics, you have a lot of matters, a lot of factors you need to approximate or ignore, choose ignore or integrate. Like for example, the adherence level, for example. Like, so how do you? This is just very general question, but how do you choose what to ignore and what to integrate?
Part of it is just about being pragmatic. So the things that we can get data for, we try and if we can get data for something, we put more effort into trying to capture that well. If we can't get data for something, then there's no benefit into trying to be very precise about it. And so we go and we approximate it and just do some sensitivity analysis.
Many thanks.
Yeah. So one of the things we did, when we've got parameters that we're uncertain about, we can just draw them from some random distribution with some shape and some mean. And our simulations, yeah, like you say, integrate over that to get some kind of uncertainty.
Thank you.
Dion, it's quite a complex model. Are some of the parameters tuned by running the model and checking it in some way, or do all the parameters come from outside essentially?
So when there isn't case data, they all come from outside. And then when you get case data, the model gets more accurate because then you can tune things. So this outbreak's been terrible for New Zealand, and it's been good for getting some nice tight parameterization for what alert level 4 and 3 does in terms of a New Zealand population. So yeah.
So you're sounding reasonably confident that your model is in fact reliable for these alert level changes and so on. I mean, the spread between the different runs, that's statistical fluctuation, right? That's not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and changing parameters. So we've got some of those parameters that we vary.
So what I'm wondering is, remember your slide with all the little cows?
Mm-hmm.
If all the different cows lead to very similar results from the model, so all the different realizations of the network lead to similar results, do you actually need the network at all, or can you have a stochastic model that's just run directly off the joint probability distribution?
So we had a master's student, that was his master's project, was to run this model forward and then use that and just use some fit a Gaussian process to it. And yeah, so we can do that. It works reasonably well in the times that you're confident. Then it becomes a case of, and I guess, what are the parameters that you fit into your, or that you vary across for your Gaussian process when you want to try and do the fitting. So we end up, for some scenarios, it makes sense to do that. We're relatively confident about what the parameters are that are changing. And then other cases where you've got lots of interventions, we do end up having to run the model forward a bunch of times anyway. So we just stick with that.
Okay, are there any further questions? There were some in the chat, which I think Emily is going to reply to Matthew about that. Matthew left 6 questions behind and then left the Zoom. Anyway, that was very good, and we look forward to both to seeing what the future results of your research is, Dion, and also, of course, to the future course of the epidemic, of which we're all extremely interested.
Thanks.
Very good. Bye, everyone.
See you. Thanks. Bye.
Ka kite.
Bye, everyone. Good to see you again.
Thank you.